반갑습니다. 국회 국방위 소속 정의당 국회의원 배준교입니다. 오늘 국제 토론회에 관심을 가져주시고 함께해 주신 모든 분들께 감사 인사를 드립니다. 저는 오늘 국회 국방위 해외 시찰 관계로 꼭 함께하고 싶었던 토론회였는데 피치 못하게 함께하지 못하게 됐습니다. 매우 아쉽지만 이렇게나마 동영상으로 인사를 나눌 수 있게 되어 다행입니다. 먼저 지구 반대편에서 늦은 시간 함께 발표자로 참여해 주시는 세계적인 석학 노음 촘스키 교수님과 먼 길 떠나 한국 국회에서 직접 발표에 참여해 주신 비자이 프라샤드 교수님께 감사 인사를 먼저 드리겠습니다. 또한 국방 분야 전문가이시면서 방송에서 늘 뵙고 있는 김종대 전 의원님과 한미 FTA 반대 운동의 선두에 계셨는데 어느 순간 유라시아 연구를 하고 계신 이혜영 한신대 교수님, 그리고 늘 진보의 국제연대 운동에 관심을 기울이게 해주는 국제전략센터 황정은 사무처장님께도 감사를 드립니다. 이번 토론회는 먼저 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁이 왜 시작됐는지를 진지하게 돌아보는 시간이 될 것으로 기대하고 있습니다. 또한 두 분의 발표자께서 말씀하실 신냉전이 무엇이고 누가 주도하고 있으며 이런 세계사적 흐름이 시작된 이유가 무엇인지 배울 수 있는 계기가 될 것입니다. 특히 그 무엇보다 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁과 신냉전이 우리 한반도에 끼칠 영향이 무엇인가 생각해 볼 수 있는 계기가 될 것입니다. 그러나 무엇보다 한국의 정치권에게 저 멀리 동유럽에서 발생한 전쟁에 대해 무관심하거나 진영 논리로만 바라보는 시각에서 벗어나 우리는 무엇을 해야 하는가에 대한 대안이 제시되기를 바라겠습니다. 특히 미국의 전 세계 군사 전략이 중동 철군 이후에 어떻게 변했는지 전문가들을 통해 확인하고 더욱 강화되어 가고 있는 한미일 군사동맹이 단순히 윤석열 정부의 친미, 친일 태도뿐만 아니라 미국의 군사전략 속에서 어떤 함의를 가지고 있는지 확인할 수 있는 그런 토론회가 되기를 기대합니다. 또한 이런 세계 정세 속 한국의 진보는 어떤 행동을 시작해야 하는지 고견을 듣는 자리가 되기를 또한 기대하겠습니다. 마지막으로 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁으로 시작된 신냉전이 한반도에 미치는 영향이라는 주제의 국제 토론회가 한국 사회 다방면의 진지한 토론으로 이어지는 촉발점이 되기를 기대하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
There have been conflicts and confrontations throughout history, often bloody, destructive, murderous. Korea has suffered badly from them. Don't have to review that. But something has changed by today, and we have to keep this in mind. If there is a conflict between nuclear powers, we're all destroyed. It was horrible enough before. Now it's different. There's been a turning point. Nuclear war between major nuclear powers is simply inconceivable. Anything has to be done to prevent it. A country that carries out the first strike, even if there's no retaliation, will itself be destroyed simply by the effects of nuclear winter. So there's casual talk these days about options for nuclear war, but they're based on incredible ignorance and misunderstanding. There are no options for nuclear war unless we make a decision to destroy human life, organized life on Earth. That's a background consideration that cannot be overlooked.
Can you hear
There
me?
are flashpoints throughout the world.
Sorry,
where,
can you hear me?
Where there a
we have to
possibility exists that a nuclear war might break out. And each of these has to be carefully controlled so that it does not escalate. The threats of escalation are just too far-reaching to contemplate. We have to ensure that where there is such a threat, all steps are taken to limit mitigated so that we do not start taking steps up the escalation ladder. And you don't have to go to the war games that are played by the military to know that once you start moving, initiating any form of nuclear weapons, it will escalate quickly, permanently, to a terminal nuclear war. That is a background consideration that we must bear in mind when we consider any questions. Well, the question today is the effect on the Korean Peninsula of the Cold War initiated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I would prefer to change the chronology. I think the new Cold War started in the mid-90s, 35 years ago. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the question was, what kind of world order would emerge from the collapse of the Soviet Union, early 1990s? One vision was proposed by Mikhail Gorbachev. He called for what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with no military alliances, no victors, no defeated, common purpose, moving towards a social democratic Eurasia, encompassing the entire Eurasian landmass and beyond. This was pretty much in the spirit of the Concert of Europe that was established in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. The statesmen of Europe at the Vienna Conference established a regime in which the defeated aggressor, France had been the aggressor, almost conquered the whole region, but it was defeated finally. The defeated aggressor was not punished. It was incorporated into the new system as a participant. That led to a century of virtual peace, not totally, but a remarkable departure from the history of Europe and from what followed. From 1815 until the First World War, there was a period of relative peace based on the Concert of Europe, with its proposals, its policies that were rather similar in spirit to what Gorbachev proposed in 1991, Common European Home. The President of the United States, George Bush, toyed with this idea, didn't undermine it. It was reformulated not too differently in proposals for a partnership of peace. NATO was there, but in a background position. That was destroyed by Bill Clinton. There had been a settlement, the crucial element after the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, was the status of Germany. For Russia, of course, that's a huge issue. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times in the preceding century. Russia has obvious security concerns with regard to Germany. No need to discuss it. So the question is, what would the status of Germany be? There was an agreement between Mikhail Gorbachev for the Soviet Union, George Bush, President of the United States, and his counterparts in Europe, Kohl and Genscher, the other side, they agreed explicitly, unambiguously. Important to emphasize this because there's been a lot of deceit about it. You can look at documents, they're available. They made an unambiguous agreement that Gorbachev would agree to allow Germany to be united and to join NATO, a hostile military alliance. It's an enormous concession on the part of Russia, but there was a quid pro quo. The United States pledged not to expand NATO beyond Germany. The phrase was not 1 inch to the east. That was an explicit, definite promise. That was the basis for Gorbachev's proposals for a common European home and the early moves towards accommodation within a partnership in peace. It lasted until about 1994, when President Clinton decided to violate it by moving to incorporate former Russian satellites into NATO. The reasons he made explicit were domestic political reasons. He was concerned about ensuring that the Democrats won the ethnic vote, the Polish vote, and the vote of other ethnic minorities. And he guaranteed this, he felt, by offering them that their homeland would be incorporated in NATO. That's the beginning of the new Cold War. It didn't break out immediately. Gorbachev, of course, complained. Yeltsin, who was then prime minister, complained, objected, but Russia agreed to tolerate it up to a point. It was made very clear and explicit. Everyone understood that Russia would tolerate the entry of the former satellites into NATO, but not Georgia and not Ukraine. If you look at a map, you'll understand why. Incorporation of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO would mean that Russia is totally encircled on the south at the Black Sea, totally encircled by a hostile military force, including a rearmed Germany. No Russian leader was going to tolerate that. Every high-level U.S. diplomat who had any knowledge of the region understood this. George Kennan famously warned against it. Jack Matlock, Reagan's ambassador to Russia, a Russia specialist, strongly warned against it. Former head of the CIA, Stanfield Turner, numerous others warned that the Clintons' moves were reckless and provocative. Well, and it was made very explicit also by the Washington's major friends in Russia. Boris Yeltsin, Mikhail Gorbachev said, no Ukraine, no Georgia, will tolerate the rest. I should recall that the Operation Barbarossa, the German operation that virtually destroyed Russia in the 1940s, was launched through Ukraine. Georgia, of course, closed the circle. This is well understood in later years as well. George Bush II, the younger George Bush, in 2008, offered to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia within NATO. His own Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, a hawk, not a dove, warned that this is an extremely reckless and provocative offer. He understood, as everyone does, that no Russian leader would ever accept this. Well, in 2008, France and Germany were able to veto the proposal, but given U.S. power, remained on the books. 2014 came the uprising in Ukraine, with plenty of U.S. initiative behind it, which overthrew the Russia-oriented elected president. The new forces that took over refused his request to have a new election. They instituted provocative measures. Russia responded by taking over Crimea, controlling its one Black Sea, its one warm water port, mostly Russian-oriented population, and keeping its Black Sea options. The United States at that point began a process which is now being duplicated in Taiwan. Describe it, then I'll turn to Taiwan. The United States began a process of integrating Ukraine de facto within the US-run military alliance, NATO. We speak of NATO, but that means the United States. Started sending heavy weapons to Ukraine, carrying out joint military operations with the Ukrainian army, training them in the use of advanced weapons, moved towards interoperability of weapon systems with the United States. So it became, in effect, adjunct of the United States. In fact, moved so closely that US military journals referred to Ukraine as a de facto NATO ally. It's the way it was becoming. This was escalated further by Joe Biden when he became president, September 2021. Biden made an agreement with Ukraine for what was called an enhanced program of preparation for NATO membership. Again, understood on all sides that Russia would never tolerate this. The State Department conceded publicly that they would take no Russian security concerns into consideration. Meanwhile, there was fighting going on in the eastern region, eastern Ukraine region, the Donbas region. There was a proposal for settlement. It was the Normandy Group, it was called. France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine did come together to reach what was called the Minsk Accords, the Minsk II Accords. What they called for was neutralization of Ukraine, a status rather like Austria throughout the Cold War, or for that matter, like Mexico. There's no formal agreement, but everyone understands that Mexico can't join a Chinese-run military alliance. So that would be the status of Ukraine, neutralization. For the eastern region, Donbass, there would be some form of autonomy within a Ukrainian federation. And the problem of Crimea, which has its own properties, was put off for later discussion. That was the basic framework for negotiations. Well, it wasn't accepted. Ukraine didn't accept it. The US wouldn't press them for it. The Russian position is not totally clear, but in any event, it was not implemented. That leads us up to the invasion. The invasion was by no means a necessity. Could argue correctly that it was seriously provoked in the manner that I described. But provocation does not justify a crime. If you provoke me to commit murder, and then I commit murder, I'm responsible. It's my crime, despite the provocation. Emmanuel Macron, French president, who's about the one like figure in the modern period, and is therefore vilified and condemned on both sides, attempted to negotiate with Putin, President Putin, up to the last minute. We have transcripts of their discussions in case you want to read them. They were published in the French press. Macron offered many possibilities for accommodation that would lead to a European Russia accommodation, which, short of negotiations with a neutralized Ukraine, Putin was not interested, refused to listen, finally terminated the discussions, literally with contempt. He said, "Sorry, I have no more time. I have to go ice skating." This was a couple of days before the invasion. Then came the invasion. Well, the invasion is extreme. It's for Ukraine. It's devastating. It has side effects which are enormous. One is the possible threat of nuclear war. Another is mass starvation. The Black Sea region is a major exporter, one of the world's major exporters of grain and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, mostly blocked. Much of the world is facing mass starvation because of this. Egypt relies for the large majority of its nutrients on exports from that region. Just yesterday, it got its first shipment, and this is happening everywhere. The steps that were being taken by the countries of the world limited, but some steps towards dealing with the existential crisis of climate warming have been reversed, terminated, and reversed. That's probably the most serious consequence of the war, apart from the possibility of nuclear war. Well, that's at that point one of the effects of the invasion was to drive Europe into Washington's pocket, to eliminated the ideas that had been floated for a long time of Europe joining accommodations with Russia and opening to the Chinese market, the huge China-based Belt and Road Initiative throughout Asia and beyond, terminated that, at least temporarily, and turned Europe into a Washington satellite. That's Europe's hopes of becoming an independent force in world affairs, going back to de Gaulle, Willy Brandt, were dashed by the invasion, at least temporarily. That does create a new global system, and that brings us to the Korean Peninsula. Let's turn to that. It has big effects on it. One effect is that the now more powerful NATO system, with Europe fully embedded in it, increasing armaments, more linked to the US system, has now expanded its scope. It's not a North Atlantic system anymore. The NATO system, the NATO summit a couple of weeks ago announced for the first time that NATO is expanding to the Indo-Pacific region. So the North Atlantic now includes Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, US allies were invited to participate in the NATO meetings. This expands the new Cold War, which began in the 1990s. It now expands it to Asia, and Korea is right in the middle of it. Meanwhile, the United States, let's take a look at the China-US confrontation. has been the key point, rather like Ukraine and Europe, is Taiwan. What will be the status of Taiwan? There were, as I'm sure you know, there were agreements in the 1970s between the United States and China, which settled on a policy called the One China policy. The United States agrees that Taiwan is part of China, but China and the United States accept a policy that's called in diplomacy strategic ambiguity. We agree, not formally, but in practice, we agree that neither side will use force to disrupt this agreement. Well, that has kept peace in the region for 50 years, which is not a small period in international affairs, particularly in areas of tension. It's now being disrupted. There's blame. You can distribute blame on all sides, but overwhelmingly now, it's the United States which is disrupting the arrangement by carrying out highly provocative actions. One of them is to create what is officially called under Biden a ring of sentinel states, US allies, heavily armed with precision weapons supplied by the United States aimed at China. It's a ring encircling China. Includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, US Pacific Islands, of course, Guam, others. US is trying to incorporate India in it, but India is vacillating, doesn't want to take part in this conflict, just as it doesn't take part in the European war. Here you have a ring of sentinel states threatening China with advanced weapons, backed by major, huge naval operations, RIMPAC they're called, essentially threatening China. All of that is the background for the provocations with regard to Taiwan. One which was well publicized was the visit of Nancy Pelosi, a high-ranking U.S. House Speaker, high-ranking U.S. official, breaking the tacit strategic ambiguity. China responded by military maneuvers, which demonstrated that China can blockade Taiwan, which of course it can. Taiwan is an island, with symbolic actions showing there's danger. Well, the United States went beyond. After Pelosi's visit, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee called for legislation on what's called a Taiwan policy action. This calls for providing more weapons to Taiwan, moving towards interoperability of weapon systems, training, and so on. If you've paid attention to Ukraine, you can recognize this is what was done in the years prior to the Russian invasion, duplicated now on Taiwan, calling for treating Taiwan with the same, providing Taiwan with the same diplomatic status as any other country. So no different how Taiwan is treated from any other country, to move towards turning Taiwan into a de facto NATO partner, NATO now having expanded to the Indo-Pacific region with the involvement of Korea. Well, Korea itself has had a policy of strategic ambiguity with relation South Korea with relation to North Korea. It's been called strategic ambiguity. That's also now in danger with more militant actions on both sides. but the big problem, core problem, is China and the United States. More recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration virtually declared war on China. That's the way it's described in the international business press. Not my terminology. London Financial Times, world's major business journal, U.S. business journal, virtually a declaration of war. The United States, the Biden administration announced that it would use its control over the international system of supply chain to ensure that China cannot carry out technological development. It will block Chinese technological development by preventing any company anywhere, Netherlands, Germany, United States, anywhere, from providing China with any of the components that are required for advanced technology. Well, you take a look at the semiconductor system, microchip system. It's a very complex of contributions from countries all over the world. Something can be manufactured in Japan, improved in the Netherlands, using a design made in the United States, put together in Malaysia or in Taiwan. It becomes microchips, an international system. The United States has now stated it's over. We're not going to allow it. We're not going to allow the Netherlands to provide the kind of advanced materials that it alone can produce that will be usable for semiconductors for Chinese development. It's a virtual declaration of war, as the business press describes it. More of the background. Well, right in the middle of this sits Korea, with decisions to make about what role to play in this emerging world system. And in the background is what I began with. Any moves that lead towards escalating nuclear war, even the threat of it, are virtually a death sentence for human society, cannot be tolerated. I think that's the general situation as it appears to me.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing us to bring this message to South Korea. The idea of the new Cold War is very chilling and dangerous. China is a country in Asia, and it's not going anywhere. It can't be taken out of Asia and put somewhere else. China also has neighbors such as India, Japan, Korea. These neighbors can't be taken out and put somewhere else. China and its neighbors are going to have to live with each other. Well, the Chinese government is also not going to be removed. You can't remove 96 million members of the Communist Party and put them somewhere else. Regular polls of the Chinese people, including by US polling agencies, show satisfaction with their government. If you can't move China from Asia, and if you can't remove the Chinese government, you're going to have to come to some accommodation with it. Furthermore, China is growing at a rate not seen before in this region. Despite the COVID pandemic, despite the turbulence in the financial system, China continues to have economic growth. Every single one of China's neighbors is deeply integrated into an economic system that includes China. For the Republic of Korea, China is the principal trading partner. For Japan, China is the principal trading partner. For Australia, China is the principal trading partner. These countries have to come to terms with their existence beside China. In fact, rationally, the Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, India don't really have a problem with China. Now, every big country poses a challenge to its neighbors. There are often disputes over borders. There are maybe disputes over sea lanes. These disputes have to be managed reasonably. These disputes cannot be exaggerated. Now, China is pursuing a path called common prosperity. It doesn't seem to be interested in conflict and war. The United States, on the other hand, openly sees China as its main strategic competitor. Ruling elites in the United States are worried by the rise of China. What worries them isn't really democracy or human rights. They are worried by Chinese economic growth, particularly growth in high-tech sectors that challenge US multinational corporations. And so they are pursuing a new Cold War against China to block its economic growth. And they are dragging China's neighbors into an unfortunate confrontation. The Republic of Korea must not play a provocative role against China. That would be terrible for the Korean Peninsula. Even US President Joe Biden admitted that US policy has been reckless. At the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, he said something very important. He said the United States has to manage competition against China responsibly. By saying that, he's admitted that for the last 20 years, the United States has managed the competition irresponsibly. Countries in Asia must not be dragged into an irresponsible confrontation against China. In the next 20 years, the center of gravity of the world economy is going to move more and more to Asia. The top 10 largest economies in the world will be China, India, Japan, Republic of Korea, Indonesia, and Vietnam. About 7 of the largest countries in the world will be in Asia. We need to learn the habits of collaboration and reject the knee-jerk approach of confrontation. Maybe we should study the Chinese philosophy of win-win. I mean, I'll admit it sounds a little silly, win-win. Can all sides really win-win? But frankly, human beings who are terrified of nuclear war and climate change prefer win-win. Win-win sounds better than win-lose. In fact, the US policy is not really win-lose. It really is lose-lose. So you have to decide, do you want lose-lose or do you want win-win? I prefer win-win. Thanks a lot.
네, 여러분 감사합니다. 짧은 논평을 하겠습니다. 모든 시대의 새로운 전환은 항상 전쟁으로부터 시작했습니다. 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁은 지난 30년 세계화 시대가 종식되고 새로운 시대로 전환되는 분기점입니다. 이는 1990년의 걸프전이 세계화 시대를 연극한 아주 유사합니다. 네, 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁은 플랫폼이 지배하는 초독점의 시대를 연극합니다. 실리콘밸리의 테크 기업은 전쟁이라는 특수 상황에서 어떤 규제도 받지 않은 활동의 자유를 누리고 있습니다. 안면인식 기술 또는 위성 와이파이, 인공지능 기술은 현재 이 전쟁의 모든 양상을 지배하고 있습니다. 그 영향력은 이미 군산복합체를 압도하고 있습니다. 예컨대 일론 머스크 한 명의 현금 동원력이면 미국의 5개 방위 산업을 전부 인수하고도 남습니다. 게다가 일론 머스크는 이번에 종전 협상까지도 제안하고 있습니다. 따라서 이 전쟁에서 누가 전투원이고 민간인인지에 대한 구분조차도 모호해졌습니다. 이 전쟁으로 미국이 새로운 기술 지배를 확립하게 되면 빅테크 기업은 전 세계를 자신의 디지털 플랫폼에 흡수하여 통치하는 신봉건 사회로 나아갈 것입니다. 이에 대해 중국과 러시아는 자신들은 미국과 분리된 별도의 문명권을 형성해야 돼. 별도의 문명이라고 선언하고자 합니다. 이로 인해 강대국 간의 격렬한 갈등과 분쟁의 가능성이 확대되는 구조가 만들어졌습니다. 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁을 통해서 중국은 미국과의 전략 경쟁을 오히려 확대해야 한다는 교훈을 얻고 말합니다. 지난 20차 당대회에서 시진핑은 연설의 절반을 안보 문제에 할애했습니다. 미국과 중국의 경쟁은 2030년대의 절대 강자 위치를 선점하는 시간이 핵공경 또는 지정학의 우위를 차지하려는 군비 경쟁으로 이어집니다. 한반도는 미국과 중국의 세력권이 중첩되는 혼돈의 영역에 위치합니다. 여기서 대한민국에 다가오는 비극은 대한민국이 미국 편이냐 중국 편이냐 선택을 강요하게 받는 딜레마를 강요받는 방식. 특히 우려스러운 점은 최근 주변 국가에 다양한 종류의 핵무기가 확산되고 있다는 것. 4월부터 푸틴이 구사한 핵사용 위협은 이제까지 핵무기에 대한 기존관념의 일대 변화를 초래하고 있습니다. 이제는 핵무기가 방어용 또는 억제용이 아닌 사용 가능한 핵무기로 인식이 변화하고 있다. 예컨대 히로시마와 나가사키, 일본의 핵이 투하된 시대를 제1세대라고 한다면 냉전 시대 핵은 갖고 있을 때 사용하지 않는 2세대의 두 번째 핵시대가 열렸고 이제는 핵을 실전에서 사용할 수 있는 제3의 핵시대가 열립니다. 최근에 실전에 사용 가능한 핵무기는 점점 더 소형화된 핵무기, 또 간편하게 사용할 수 있는 전술 핵무기를 열립니다. 또한 그 핵무기를 운반할 수 있는 다양한 수단, 즉 미사일의 중요성이 증대하고 있습니다. 이런 현상이 북한과 남한 그리고 중국에서 공히 나타나고 있는 현상입니다. 이 외에도 국가와 시민들이 서로를 적대와 혐오의 대상으로 인한 국가 부족주의 정서가 분쟁 가능성을 초래하고 있습니다. 평평한 세계는 다시 벽 있는 세계로 변하고 있습니다. 이러한 시대의 문턱에서 평화와 협력의 공간과 가치를 복원하지 않으면 가장 먼저 동북아시아의 분쟁이 발생할 가능성이 있습니다. 그런 점에서 오늘 오신 친구들을 환영하면서 우리가 평화와 협력에 손을 마주잡을 것을 제안합니다. Thank you, everyone.
안녕하세요. 이혜영 교수입니다. 간략히 세 가지 점에 대해서 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째는 여러분 다 아시다시피 대한민국은 몇 가지 세계적인 기록을 가지고 있습니다. 세계에서 자살률이 가장 높습니다. 세계에서 출산율이 가장 낮습니다. 토마 피케티라는 프랑스 경제학자가 개발한 베타 지수로 보면 세계에서 가장 불평등한 나라입니다. 심지어 프랑스 대혁명 이전보다 더 불평등합니다. 이대로 간다면 100년 안에 한국은 없어질 겁니다. 여기에 또 하나 새로운 기록이 첨가되었습니다. G20 국가들 대통령의 지지율을 비교한 표를 본 적이 있습니다. 대한민국의 윤석열 대통령이 세계에서 지지율이 가장 낮은 걸로 나왔습니다. 예, 축하드립니다. 그런데 바로 이 대통령이 지금 추구하고 있는 대한민국의 외교를 보면 끝없는 긴장 격화, 결국 가고자 하는 방향은 한국을 미국의 재식민지화가 아닌가 우려됩니다. 혹은 유럽과 유럽은 마찬가지로 미국 식민지 아닌가요? 한국도 그 대열에 곧 합류할 거로 보입니다. 그렇기 때문에 그 한국에 대한 그 장밋빛 청사진은 저로서는 동의하기가 매우 어렵습니다. 두 번째에 대해서 말씀드리겠습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁의 결과와 관계가 되기도 하고 되지도 않는 게 미국 주도의 단극 체제의 몰락이 아닌가 생각합니다. 제가 보기에는 단극 체제가 다극 체제로 이행하는 것은 불가피해 보입니다. 바로 이러한 거대한 지정학적 구조 변화의 측면에서 보자면 두 개의 단층대가 관찰됩니다. 하나는 우크라이나고 하나는 한반도입니다. 바로 이런 관점에서 미국의 제국주의와 대한민국의 윤석열이 추구하고 있는 외교라고 하는 것이 얼마나 위험한지 정말 우려를 금할 수가 없습니다. 특히 최근 몇 달 사이에 남쪽과 북쪽이 각각 미사일 내지 포탄을 쏘는 것이 거의 일상이 되어가고 있습니다. 그래서 이런 안보 환경에서 보자면 남북한 관계라든지 남북한 관계는 암울하기 짝이 없습니다. 세 번째에 대해서 말씀드리겠습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁 이후에 전 세계적으로 관찰된 매우 특이한 현상이 하나가 있습니다. 바로 얼마 전에 미 하원의 프로그레시브 코크스라고 하는 단체가 조직이 성명을 발표했습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁을 끝내기 위한 선제적 평화를 제안했던 내용입니다. 하지만 몇 시간 지나지 않아서 꼬리를 내립니다. 지켜보던 저로서도 창피하기 이를 데가 없었습니다. 이 글로벌 차원에서 볼 때 진보 세력의 역량이 여기까지구나 하는 생각을 하게 되었습니다. 희망은 있는지 회의하게 되었습니다. 다 망할 것 같습니다. 또 미국의 언론 NYT라든지 영국의 가디언이라든지 보면 더욱더 암울합니다. 그래서 저는 이 리버럴 네오콘 혹은 진보 네오콘이라고 부를 수 있는 이 현상에 주목합니다. 가뜩이나 진보 세력의 전망이 어두운데 바로 이 리버럴 네오콘 또는 진보 네오콘의 역할이 더욱더 미래를 암울하게 만들고 있습니다. 이 현상은 한국도 크게 다르지 않습니다. 이 엄혹한 정서에서 진보 세력의 단결과 연대만이 이 국면을 헤쳐나갈 수 있을 텐데 현실은 그렇지가 않습니다. 이대로 간다면 전 세계 진보는 멸종될 겁니다. 이상입니다. 감사합니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 국제전략센터 황정을입니다. 네, 오늘 제가 말씀드릴 건 뉴스에서 많이 듣고 계시는 신냉전이 실제로 한국 사회에 미치는 영향이 우리가 알고 있는 것보다 훨씬 크다는 내용입니다. 네, 그래서 두 가지로 정리해서 말씀드리고 마지막으로 제안 말씀드리겠습니다. 네, 먼저 한국 정부는 신냉전 하에서 문제 해결을 위한 연대와 협력보다는 갈등과 분쟁에서 누구의 편에 설 것인가를 분명히 했습니다. 네, 하지만 실제 그 선택으로 인해 파생되는 여러 가지 문제는 어떠한 영향을 미칠지 그리고 대책은 무엇인지는 보이지 않았습니다. 예를 들어서 윤석열 정부는 지난 6월 마드리드에서 열린 나토 정상회담에 참석했습니다. 이 회의에서 채택된 전략 개념에 대한 내용을 확실히 모른 채 참석했고요. 그리고 이 회의에 참석한 윤석열 대통령은 나토의 중러 견제에 동참한다는 전략적 메시지를 대내외적으로 밝혔습니다. 이어서 8월에 국내에 배치된 사드 기지 정상화를 선언하기도 했습니다. 네, 뿐만 아니라 지난 8월 낸시 펠로시 하원 의장이 대만을 방문한 이후 한반도를 둘러싼 긴장은 굉장히 고조되었습니다. 이어서 미국 의회의 싱크탱크인 의회조사국이 중국이 대만 침공에 대비해서 주한미군의 역할을 확대해야 한다는 보고서를 제출했다는 소식도 들려옵니다. 이 지역에서 도전이 시작될 경우에 한반도 자체가 매우 위험해질 수 있다는 말이기도 합니다. 한국에 막대한 피해를 줄 것이 불보듯 뻔한 이 전쟁에 우리의 의사와 정치적 결정과는 상관없이 휘말려 들어갈 위험이 매우 높은 상황입니다. 이러한 상황에 대한 우리 정부의 대책이 실제로 존재하는지 묻고 싶습니다. 두 번째로 신냉전은 현재 세계의 패권을 장악하고 있는 미국에 의해서 주도되고 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 신냉전을 둘러싼 담론도 미국 그리고 서구 주류 언론이 주도하고 있습니다. 그렇다면 우리가 주로 접하는 내용들은 과연 얼마나 객관적인 사실이고 우리가 그것에 기반해서 판단한다면 잘못된 판단을 할 가능성도 크다고 생각합니다. 그래서 오늘 여기 참석하신 분들도 노엄 촘스키부터 비자이 프라샤드 그리고 토론자 분께서 이야기해 주신 내용이 자주 들어본 내용은 아닐 거라고 생각합니다. 네, 그래서 우리가 해야 될 것은 좀 더 역사적인 맥락에서 상황을 이해하는 노력을 스스로 해야 하는 상황입니다. 이러한 상황에서 지금 우리가 해야 하는 것은 무엇일까요? 현재처럼 갈등이 발생하고 주류 담론이 장악하고 있는 현재 한국 사회에서는 안보를 강조하는 보수당의 입지는 강화되고 개혁과 진보의 입지는 좁아지고 있는 상황입니다. 그리고 신냉전은 장기적일 것이라고 예상이 되고 점점 더 첨예화될 것이라고 예상됩니다. 이런 상황에서 지금 우리에게 필요한 것은 누구의 편에 설 것인가를 계산하는 것은 아닙니다. 신냉전에 반대하는 반전운동 연합을 건설하고 이 건설에 나설 저항의 주체를 찾아야 합니다. 신냉전은 저 먼 나라에서 일어나는 일이 아니라 한반도에도 가까이 다가오고 있는 현실입니다. 그래서 문제를 해결하기 위한 협력과 연대라는 가치를 실현하는 국제연대 행동을 이 한반도에서도 복원해야 합니다. 국제전략센터는 이러한 연대 행동을 만들기 위해 앞장설 것이고 오늘처럼 전 세계의 활동과 지식인들과 지속적인 연대와 소통을 만들어 나갈 것입니다. 그 길에 여기 계신 많은 분들도 함께 꼭 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.